All right, I can't wait to get into it. The reason why we're recording, by the way, instead of live streaming is that YouTube won't let us put up videos right now. So I'm looking for another platform. We can talk about that later. Since we're all treading water with our schedules, luckily I've got a really great idea, which is tomorrow there is no reading. I'm going to do a reading from an excerpt of Plato, which I think is going to bring some perspective that the rest of the excerpts we're going to be reading is missing. And it's a very, very serious approach to this question that's going to be a nice standard for us to have in our mind when we look at the rest of everything else. So today we're going to discuss the intro to our new section, Body, Mind, and Death. And we're going to talk about the various camps and the battlefield, the layout of the land like we did the last time. And we're going to get ready to get into this topic. I know most of the students here are very, very, very interested in AI and the philosophy of AI. So pay careful attention because this is the deep underpinnings of that entire thing. And so now we're getting into a subject that's really what we're looking for. So if I say add to stage, there it is. Okay. So Edwards and Paps give us an introduction into the body, mind, and death question. Why don't we do, no, we can't do that. Cover it up. Let's do it like this. So let's get into it, because one of the things we want to cover today is really so that we've got some clear idea of what the heck this question is. It's very related to the determinism free will one that we just finished. They're very connected, as all philosophical questions are connected, the way Edwards and Paps had pointed out in the general introduction. But, this question, it's not quite as immediately clear to us sometimes. What is the question in the first place? And so what we're going to probably end up doing is reversing around that question by just looking at all the different potential answers until it's pretty clear what each of them is trying to solve as the same question. So let's get into it. So Edwards and Paps introduced to us most of these camps. They didn't include one or two of them, which I added. But the various camps in the introduction that they talked about for answering this question. And in short, the question is something like this. If you believe that you're just a body, that's fine. But if you believe that you're a body and a mind, that you're a body and a soul, if you have a dualistic perspective on what makes up a person, the question of how those two things could possibly interact with each other is a pretty heavy philosophical question. It might sound like a curious sort of tangential curiosity question, but it's actually really, really core. And it's just like determinism and free will. It's a question that people come back to all the time, no matter what it is that they're looking at that's related to this subject. And so this is why it's one of the big questions that we're going to be looking at in this course. And so, well, at first you'd say, well, what's the problem exactly, maybe? But we have to remember that mind is usually defined as something that is not anything like body. If body is material, which is usually the way that people think about it, it's not the only way people think about it, but it's usually the way people think about it. And then mind is definitely not that, right? The whole point of bringing up dualism in the first place is the idea that, come here, that body, that mind is something totally different from body. Usually when people are dualistic, they even describe the mind as something that has no extension. It has no, maybe even no position and locality in space exactly, that it's something that has none of the qualities of matter and body because it's a completely different thing. And then the question is, well, if it's so different, how does it interact? How does it interact in any way with the body? How can something that has no mass push on things with mass or be pushed on by them? You're talking about two completely different realms here. So that's the question. So the various camps that Edwards and Paps, or that's one way of conceptualizing the question. The various camps that Edwards and Paps bring up is dualistic interactionists. These are people who believe in two things, a body and a mind, and they believe that there's some way that the two can interact, and they have different ways of trying to solve that problem. Substance theorists and bundle theorists are two subcategories of dualistic interactionists, according to Paps, and according to the authors of the book and the introduction. Edwards and Pap. I should stop mispronouncing that. Edwards and Pap. I think that's one way of subdividing them, I suppose, but it's it's not necessarily the only way. Then there are monists, and Edwards and Papp did not bring up idealists at all, as far as I remember. I reread it a couple of times. They do bring up monistic materialists as people who say there's body and only body, and then they mention Nietzsche is in that category, which I don't think is actually correct. Nietzsche, well, we'll talk about Nietzsche. There's a reason why we spend all of our third year basically focusing on understanding Nietzsche. He's very difficult to pin down, and he says things that are easy to misunderstand, and it's easy, and people want to annex an intellect like his into their camps. So there's books written as for everything. Nietzsche as this, Nietzsche as that, Nietzsche as this, and I think Edwards and Papp maybe took a quote of his about body and nothing besides, and forgot to remember that Nietzsche is not a materialist. So what he meant by body wasn't exactly what a materialist would mean by body. But we'll talk a little bit more about that today, and probably not much more at all anyway in this course. But let me do what I should have done before and mute my phone. Please forgive me for not remembering to do that earlier, but apparently the dog is going to make noise, wanting to go outside, and the phone is going to make noise. All right. So the monistic materialists, it's pretty simple. Clue is in the title. They believe that you are a body and nothing besides. You are material and nothing besides. The soul or the mind, that's just something that it's a word we use for something the brain does, maybe, but it's really just brain and body, and those are both body. All right. So that's a way of dealing with the problem, is to say I don't have to answer how they interact, because the mind is something the body is doing, something like that, which again is very much something that Nietzsche said. What did he say? He said, I don't want to stick on Nietzsche too much today, but it's easy to understand why Edwards and Papp would put him in this category, although that is a mistake, I think. But he said, the body or the mind says, I am you, but the body just does you. So he's put it, anyway, his actual view is more complicated than that, but it's easy to understand why someone would put him in as a materialist when he's not. It actually might be closer to true to say that he's an idealist, which also would be wrong, but it would be closer to the truth than to say he's a monistic materialist. He's certainly a monist, though. In any case, we're done talking about Nietzsche. The idealists, of course, say, yeah, there's only one thing, so I don't have to explain how the two different things interact, but the one thing that there is at the base of reality is something mental. It's something soulish. It's something psychic. It's something of that quality, of the mind quality, not of the body quality as you conceptualize it with material. So the monists are basically trying to escape the problem, or glory in the fact that they don't have to deal with the problem, by trying to come up with a system where they say there aren't two things. We're not dualists, so we don't have to deal with how the two interact with each other. We're just introducing the camps. What we're going to find, and what the introduction does a really good job of outlining, is that there are really serious problems with all of these camps, right? None of these camps is so easy to believe without super hard challenges that the debate is over. And what's cool about that is that we sort of have a lot more camps than we did in our previous discussion with determinism and free will. We kind of had three camps: the determinists, the free will people, the libertarians, and then the compatibilists. There were a couple others, but basically that was the main thing. But there's a lot of different ways of trying to rectify this problem. And so we move on to the epiphenomenalists. The epiphenomenalists are very, very interesting. Essentially, they say something like, this whole mind thing that's obviously very different from body, this whole subjective experience thing, the quality, all of the beauty and all of that stuff, that's not really causing anything. It's more like maybe an accidental thing that rides on top of all the material stuff, which is really the source of all the interaction. So there's no reason to think of it interacting. It's something that accompanies the stuff that does the interacting. But the interacting might be body and brain as body, and it's doing everything. But isn't it great that brain has this extra cream in the coffee, the gin in the Campari, this little magic, tasty, beautiful musical component to it that just sort of accompanies everything the body's doing. So you don't have to look for interaction. Just all the interaction is this body level, material level. But there's this really cool thing that's like a decorative feature that rides on top. So there's problems with that view, and we'll look at that. But that's an interesting view to have. Let's jump down for a second to the parallelists. These people are extremely interesting. And there's a lot of different ways of being parallelists. Let's start with the harmonists. So obviously, again, clue is in the title. They believe in a harmony. They're basically saying there's two worlds. And both of these worlds are, they're sort of, let's say it this way. Let's say there's two worlds. Let's stick with that because that'll allow the perspectivists to have their own way of conceptualizing it. There's two worlds and they are perfectly in harmony with each other. So I pick up some chocolate cake, I put it in my mouth, and I taste the sweetness. Well, the sweetness is a thing in my mind. It's nothing in the sugar molecule that makes it sweet, right? I desire the chocolate cake because of the sweetness. I pick up the chocolate cake because my body has neurons and muscles and material things that it's doing. I'm willing to pick up the chocolate cake, and my brain is making the decision for my arm to move, right? It's like two things are happening always at every moment. And so they don't have to interact with each other, right? This is another way of trying to get away from having to explain how they interact and say, well, they don't interact with each other. They're just in harmony with each other. And maybe that's because God created the world originally with a set of rules that would make sure that they were always in harmony with each other. That's one perspective. But you can think of the epiphenomenalists as being harmonists in some ways, because they do think that they always go together like that, but they don't exactly think that the mental things are, they're not as the way it's conceptualized in Edwards and Papp, at least, is that the mental things that ride on top are not really as immediately actively real in the world. They're just sort of riding on top. But the harmonists are saying, no, both of these are completely real pictures of reality. You could look at everything through this perspective or at everything through this perspective, and you could explain and record all the things that happen in the world, because the world is two things at once, completely always in harmony. That's an interesting idea. The perspectivists, which I was trying very hard to define the harmonists in a way where it wouldn't overlap with the perspectivists almost say that there's one world, but it could be looked at from two different perspectives. And we see now some real similarities between certain camps in the determinism free will debate, where they say, look, one of the pictures of it is really nice, is this line, this curved line. Every time you look at the curved line from one perspective, your eye sees concavity. Every time you look at that same line from the other perspective, you see convexity. But it's just one line looked at from two different perspectives. And so they're saying, well, all of the mental is mirror imaging of all of the physical, right? My brain triggers my body to move, but my mind wills my body to move. And it does. They're both happening at the same time, but really just one thing is happening. So you don't need two things in harmony. One thing is happening, but it can be comprehended in two different ways. This is Spinoza's view, by the way. We won't say he invented the view, but let's say he's the king or the father of modern perspectivism, as he's the founder of more than that. But in the context of this class and what we're discussing in this section, we could call him the guy that's the head of the troops from that part of the battlefield. And his view was that we have two languages. We have a way of describing things as they are to us and the impact they make on our consciousness. We'll call that the subject. So we'll call it the subjective language, in the sense that it's in relationship to a subject observing things, not in the connotation that where you say it's relativism or something like that. We just mean it's we're describing the phenomena of the universe and the sequence of those phenomena and how they interact with each other and maybe causality, all through the lens of the impressions that they're making on the observer. And then we have the objectivist, where we say, let me separate myself from this world and describe the things that are happening in a sort of matter-of-fact kind of way. And that his position was you could describe everything in the universe using the first language. And you could describe everything in the universe using the second language. And there's nothing that helps you translate between the two languages. And his view is that God gave us the gift of two different languages for understanding everything. And then he speculated that maybe God has 1,000 other languages that he also uses to look at everything, but we only have available to us two, and it's still two very nice languages. So that was his perspective. But Malebranche is very interesting. And I love wild ideas that, everybody loves Zeno and his paradoxes. There's no such thing as change. Achilles can't catch the tortoise, that kind of thing. There's all sorts of really wild ideas in philosophy. I think occasionalism, which is how Edwards and Papp define it, it's really Malebranche's. He would be the king of this if Spinoza is the king of perspectivism. And they're both students of Descartes, right? They're both rationalists who came after Descartes, who basically, we think of Descartes, whether this is accurate or not, we think of him as basically inventing the mind-body problem in a sense. Of course, he didn't invent it, but everybody refers to in philosophy the dualism of Descartes, right? It's like, okay, he's making science possible, and he's also caring about a priori rationality at the same time. And so he sort of splits off two schools of thinking. Rationalists and empiricists come after him. And Malebranche and Spinoza are both in the rationalist side. So you can think of the rationalists as trying to wrestle with what Descartes was attempting to do, and the empiricists also trying to wrestle with what he was doing. And we talk a lot more about that in the second year, so I'm not going to go into that right now. I'm sorry for the digression. In any case, here's Malebranche's wild idea. Rationalists care about ideas. Ideas are everything. Parmenides was being a rationalist. It shouldn't be fair to call him that. But let's say Parmenides is in the same psychological camp of the two psychological camps in which all philosophers can be placed, according to Fichte, that the rationalists would have to be placed into. He's caring about ideas so much that he really examines the ideas until he sees what conclusions follow from them. And then he believes those conclusions, even if they're outrageous to everyone's experience. What does it matter that you think you saw a guy pass another guy in a race? I know that's not possible. That must be an illusion. I know so because I cared enough about the ideas. That's sort of one psychology. That's the idealist, can go into that category of the psychological camp of approach to philosophy. The rationalist can. The pre-Socratics, or we should say the post-Thelesians maybe, who fall into that Parmenidean side of things, are also in that same camp. So here's Malebranche. Here's the rationalist after Descartes who says that. Here's what he said. He said, I looked at the idea of matter. Do you know what idea of matter you really have in your brain? Extension. Taking up space. Length, breadth, and width. That's what you mean when you say something exists materially and physically. You mean it's in a location. You mean it takes up space. You don't really mean much besides that, perhaps, or maybe he included other things that it means, but it means essentially the other. We could add a few other things to it. It means those things. And then here's what he said. I looked at those things long enough until I realized that there's nothing in that idea that has the ability to induce motion in anything else like that idea. When a ball hits another ball, it doesn't have the ability to make the ball move. That's not possible because I looked at the idea that I have of object, and it doesn't include anything that would make it able to induce motion in anything else. He looked at the idea of mind, And he concluded that there's nothing in that idea that would be able to move bodies, that would be able to move matter. He carefully analyzed, he says, there's nothing in that idea that has the ability to induce motion in the other. So his conclusion is that bodies cannot move bodies and minds cannot move bodies. So what's going on? His conclusion is that God is rational and reasonable. And he created a world that looks as if it behaves according to laws, but it doesn't. In reality, God performs a miracle every single time a ball bumps into another ball to force them to behave in a way that would be in accordance with the laws as we describe them of the conservation of momentum and matter and all those things. So every time a physical body moves another, that's another miracle that God is performing. And every time I will to move my hand and then my hand moves, it's because God comes in to fill in the gap with another miracle. He's actually involved in making sure that when I will to move my arm actually moves, because there's nothing in the ideas. Okay, that's an occasionalist, that's the name that Edwards and Papp give it. It's every time the mind tries to give motion to the body, it's the occasion for God to step in and do a miracle. All right, well, that's quite interesting. Then there's another group of people who try to rectify this problem. And you know what? They're sort of like monists. Actually, that's what I'll change the slide on this. Let's say there's three categories of monists. There's idealists who say it's all mind. There's materialists who say it's all body. And then there's panpsychists who say, I think the proper way to say it would be this: it's all nature. But nature is not material. Nature is something that it encapsulates everything you think of when you think of material and everything you think of when you think of mind. It's one thing. There's no need for the two to interact because nature has a psychic component, a consciousness component to it. Now, one of the reasons why people laugh at this idea is that they think that the consciousness that you have is in a rock and that's what they're claiming. That's not really what almost any of them are claiming. The vast, vast majority, maybe all of them, are claiming that there's whatever makes up your consciousness, which is very sophisticated, the rudimentary elements of it are also in everything else. So rocks have some of the basic ingredients of consciousness, in the sense that your mind is made up of chemicals that are also in the rocks, and that those chemicals, when they're in the rocks and when they're in your brain, are able to rely upon attributes when they're in your brain to put together all the things that make sensation and feeling and conscious experience possible. So they're actually, now that I think about it, they're monists in the middle between idealists and materialists, who say, the monists say it's all material or it's all mental, or they say it's all nature and nature is both those things. So it's not two different things. And how do they interact? It's, well, the material has lots of different qualities, and you just didn't include a few qualities that nature has because you were restricting it to the ones that would apply to the material only, or to the mental only. So that's a nice little brief overview. Maybe I should have gone through other slides. Let's look at the problem here. If mind and body are two different things, two different substances, essences, natures, how can the one affect the other and vice versa? Worded another way, are we one thing, two things, or three things, or what? And if we're two things, how is it that those two things can interact? For our purposes, we're going to be looking at two things, mind and body. And we're going to be asking ourselves, how could they possibly interact? So we'll look at just a couple of the camps, the various camps. So first, dualistic interactionists. Dualistic interactions say we are two things, mind and body, and the two interact with each other. The will is mental, and it makes the body move. The senses are a part of the body, and they create impressions upon the mind in the form of sensations. There's a two-direction interactions that happen here. And then they're subcategorized according to Edwards and Papp, at least, into two things. The first one is the bundle theorists. might be the second one they talk about in the introduction, where they say essentially a man is nothing more than his body plus his experiences, plus some abstract notions that he takes from those experiences, like similarity, and they listed a few that, you know, it wasn't exactly clear what they're talking about. When we read Plato tomorrow, it will be quite more clear. And then his capacities, habits, temperaments, and ideals. So you take those four things together, you put them together, that's what a man is. He's that and nothing more. But there are mental things in that, and there are physical things in that, and they believe that the two can interact with each other. And then there's substance theorists, and usually people think of Descartes as a substance theorist dualist. So we'll call him the founder of the whole damn problem. He's not, but in the modern version of it. And we'll say, okay, what they're saying is, yeah, you're all those things for sure, but there's also a substance beyond those things called mind. All right. Your mind isn't just a collection of your experiences and abstractions and temperaments. Your mind is a substance, right? Like we think of material as made up of a substance, but it's a wildly different substance. It's like a spiritual substance. It's a mental substance. It's a substance that doesn't have any length, breadth, or width, that isn't maybe located in a specific place. It's very much outside the material world entirely. It's a completely different thing. And he gets there, obviously, by looking very carefully at ideas and the nature of ideas and at physical objects and the nature of those objects, and comes to this conclusion. We are living in a world of two different things. You know, modern people often say we're spiritual creatures having a physical experience, or we're physical creatures having a spiritual experience, or either way, Descartes' like, yes, you know, we're two different things at the same time, substantially, you know, we're made up of two different things. And so the substance theorist dualists would probably fit in with that. So that's two approaches. Then there's monists. Oh, I put epiphenomenalists here. I should have put the we'll fix this later. Anyway, we already talked about this, but the materialists say, no, we're one thing. We're bodies. Our mind is just our brain or something that it does. And it's not a different thing than the body. It's just, that's what bodies that are organized into minds or into brains can do. And the idealists are, we're one thing. That thing is mental, phenomenological, spiritual. The material is a shadow of what's truly real. It is an illusion, or it is an approximation, or at least it's dependent upon something external which sustains it, which is psychic. So just because you're an idealist doesn't mean you have to be an anti-realist, although you could be an anti-realist. Or, you know, I wonder if you can be, because if you're an idealist, you're not really an anti-realist, you're just an anti-materialist. And so we'll take that back. But in any case, there's many different types of idealists, and Edwards and Pabst didn't really include them in the intro, so we've added them here as another type of monist. And there's one type of epiphenomenologist that I think we could say, that's not all epiphenomenologists, but that we could say is a monistic materialist. You know, one type where they say, well, basically everything that really counts is physical, but, you know, what a beautiful world that this physical world can play this sweet music of consciousness over the top of it. And hey, that's beautiful and valuable, but it doesn't do anything. It doesn't have to interact in any way. It's not the cause of anything. It's just caused. You know, one of the pictures created by this is to say a brook is real, and the banks of the brook is real, and the course of the river is real, and the water in the river is real. That's the river. But when the river is babbling over a bunch of rocks, the noises that it makes, they're not really the river. They're not a part of what makes the river in a material sense. They're just music that attenuates the river. As a river goes over these rocks, it will bubble and it will babble. And that's nice. That's a nice feature of the river for sure. But you shouldn't conceptualize it as that being fundamental to the nature of the river. That's one type of epiphenomenologist. The other types maybe wouldn't really be classified into monism, but we'll say that. And we'll say there's one type of panpsychist who might fit into this idealist category as well, where the physical is an interpretation of mental impressions or an objectivist model of the mind or a dream of God or something like that. So not all panpsychists would fit into that. We already talked about the idea that they think, well, no, there's matter, there's material, there's objects, all of the qualities of objects and material and all of that, that's all real. But those are aspects of nature, and other aspects of nature are consciousness to varying degrees, and those are also out there in the same natural things. So you could have a panpsychist that was an idealist, but you could also have a panpsychist that isn't. And, so they sort of overlap, and we'll put them in there. For the rest of this, we're not going to look at any more words or any more reading. Let's just look at some pictures. So here's your monistic materialist. The body is all there is. Part of the body is the brain, and the mind is maybe something the brain is doing, or it's a part of the brain, but it's all one thing. It's all body. Then we could extract the brain out. I know we're dualists and we have 3 pictures here, but remember, the brain is sort of part mind, part body. It's maybe the mental, or maybe it's the physical part or whatever. So the dualistic interactionists are saying somehow the mind and body, this might be a better way to do it. The brain and body are together as body, perhaps, but there's some way in which the two are interacting. The body can affect the mind, obviously, right? Hit my thumb with a hammer, my mind feels pain, right? It's not just that neurons are doing physical things. There's a conscious experience. So obviously the bodies can affect minds, and minds can affect bodies. Look, I just willed to raise my arm and lower it again, or to roll my eyes at the fact that has to be the example every goddamn time somebody in philosophy wants to prove that they have free will, is the raising of the arm. We should start a habit of picking the nose. But in any case, the mind can affect the body can affect the mind. The dualistic interactionists say we just have to accept that. How that's possible, it works in practice. We still have to figure out if it works in theory, and we're not sure how to do that. And we've got different ideas of how to do that. And so the various dualistic interactionists will try to explain how this is possible, but they believe that you're two things and that they interact with one another. Here's our picture of epiphenomenalists, right? The body and the brain are interacting with each other. The brain's affecting the body, so the brain is affecting the body and the body is affecting the brain. The body and the brain are making things happen in the mind, but the mind is not affecting either of them. It's just added, floating on top. Epiphenomenalist means it's floating on top of the phenomena. It's up above. It's an added little feature that it comes along with things in a predictable, reasonable kind of a way, but it's just sort of a colorful feature that's added in. It's a way of trying to deal with this problem. And this problem is, how could these things interact at all? That's what everybody's trying to deal with. Now we'll look at the parallelists. Here's Mellenbranche. All right. The body cannot affect the mind. I don't know why I didn't do the arrows in the other direction. I thought I did them as well, but apparently I didn't. So the body tries to affect the mind, but it can't. So God comes in with a miracle and he says, okay, make it possible to affect the mind in a way that's predictable, in a way that makes sense, in a way that's reasonable, because God am reasonable, and so I'll make it all behave accordingly. And the mind tries to affect the body. I should have had arrows on the other side here pointing down, but it can't. There's a gap. It's impossible. And so God comes in and performs a miracle, saying, well, when the mind wills to move, I will cause the body to move. I will perform the miracle necessary at this occasion to make sure that everything always is sustained in a reasonable manner and in a way that fits according to my laws or design or something like that. What's a funny side note is that, or an interesting side note, is that he also thought God had to do that with bodies. A pool ball hits another pool ball. They bounce off each other at different angles based on the conservation of momentum principle. And what you just witnessed was a miracle, says Mellenbranche. What you just witnessed was a miracle. There's nothing about the concept of bodies that has the ability to induce motion in another body. I looked at the idea very carefully. We won't look at what he says here. We will look at it when we get to that part of our third year course. We'll look at it very carefully. That's only one tiny piece of what we do. We're going to look at most philosophers very carefully in our second year individually, but most of the bigs. In any case, what he comes up with his argument that it is not possible for a body to affect a body either, just like it's not possible for a mind to affect a body or for a body to affect a mind. And so he just accepts that conclusion and says, well, we've discovered that God is working all the time to sustain all things. There's an interesting Hindu idea that matches with that too, that real omnipotence would be not able to do anything, but to be doing all things at all times. And so there's a scriptural Christian idea that in him we live and breathe and move and have our being. Or there's this idea that there's not just one creation, which a lot of Cartesians think, like God created everything, wound the clock, and then walked away, and everything ticks according to his plan. But there's this other idea that Mellenbranch and a lot of religious people think, where it's like, no, the divine is constantly, every second sustaining being. And if he stopped, we'd all cease existing immediately. But he's always making it possible and saying yes to it and keeping it going. So anyway, we won't get into that more, except that's just a curious and interesting idea. Again, in the context of trying to solve this problem of how can you have two things that seem so incompatibly different interact with each other. We didn't really look at the dualistic interactionists in the sense of what their answers were, but we will when we read them. Now we've got other parallelists. These are harmonists. We talked about them. They say, look, the same thing is happening. One thing is happening, and it happens in parallel. It happens to the mind, and it happens to the body, and the mind does something as a result, and the body does something as a result. So you're really just looking at two different aspects, or no, I shouldn't even say it that way. You're looking at a dual world. The world is dualistic, but the two worlds don't interact with each other, but they're in perfect harmony. You know, if God can make the world behave according to a bunch of physical laws and principles that always hold, why can't he make two of them and make a law that they're always in harmony with each other without having too much trouble to worry about them getting out of sync? And so they, you know, not all, by the way, not all of these parallelists are believers in God either. It's just many of them are putting it in that context. But a harmonist would say, you know, event A happens, that happens. Event A happens, but really event A is event A prime and event A double prime. And event A prime happens in a mental context to the things that are mental, and the mental things respond causally to that. And event A double prime happens in a physical context, and physical things respond in a physical way, and they're always in parallel with each other, working in harmony. And then here's this really interesting parallelist perspectivist, this parallelist perspective, which is the idea that no, two things aren't really happening. It's not event A1 and event A2, or event A prime and event A double prime. It's just event A, or event E, we could call it. Event E is happening. It's just one thing that's happening. But if you look at that thing that's happening from one perspective, you see all of the physical attributes, components, dimensions to it. And if you look at that thing from another perspective, you see all of the conscious and subconscious and consciousness and subjective and mental and mind aspects of it. And you can't really look at the line from both perspectives at the same time. So when you look at it one way, you're seeing it like this. When you're looking at it the other way, you're seeming to see something completely incompatible. But the truth is, you've just changed your perspective. And now, you know, two guys looking at the same mountain from east and west might be angry at each other's reports of what the mountain looks like. Because they say, it doesn't look like that. The sun is setting behind the mountain. No, the sun is setting in front of the mountain. Behind me. What are you talking about? Well, you're both just looking at the mountain. Well, wait a minute. Does that even work? Yeah. That totally works. Sorry. Must have to brush up on my cosmology, right? Imagine a planet. Here's a mountain. Here's a guy. Here's a guy. They're looking at the mountain from opposite sides. Well, the sun is setting over here. And this guy here says, yes, what a majestic mountain that the sun goes to bed behind it. And then the guy says, how dare you describe a mountain so inaccurately? I know what mountain I'm looking at. It's a mountain where the sun has escaped behind me and the mountain is fleeing away from the sun to enter into the night world or something, right? It was like, how could you describe this so oppositely to the way I'm describing it? It's like, well, walk around the mountain and switch positions, you'll realize you're talking about the same thing. That's the idea of the perspectivists. So that's their way of, we might even call them pseudo-problemists in a sense, where they say there aren't two things and you have to figure out how they interact. There's one thing, but you're looking at it from two perspectives. Okay. Then we have the panpsychists, who are sometimes called, or like to call themselves, universal parallelists. And they basically say that story of your perspective of the two things, really everything is like that. It's not just that you can look at everything from two different perspectives, is that there's only one thing in the world. It's called mind-body or body-mind. It's not two different things. Descartes was wrong to think that you had a uniquely different substance that has all the mental. And, a lot of people think this. A lot of the heavy hitters in philosophy say, no, I've looked at ideas and I've looked at matter, and these things are two completely different things. But the universal parallelists are really saying it's not that two things are happening in parallel. It's that nature is one thing, and it encapsulates and incorporates all of the things that are mental and make impressions on the mind in a subjective way. And it encapsulates all the things that are material and can be described in that way. So what we really should maybe do is call it nature. We'll say, I'm calling it here mind-body or body-mind in the sense of trying to say, let's merge the two. But let's just call them naturalists who believe that nature is more than material. They're non-materialist naturalists, or they're super materialist naturalists. They're saying there's something super in the natural, rather than talking about super outside the natural, which is what super means. They're saying, well, there's something super in the natural. And, they may believe in a supernatural, they may deny it. That's not the point. The point is that nature is more super than the materialists think, something like that. Okay. And then there's the qualiaists, and this is a group that they mentioned, and we're going to look at them a little bit. They're very similar to epiphenomenalists in a sense. If the mind-body naturalist types are saying this, they're almost sort of saying the same thing. Their picture is sort of the same shape, where you've got the square of the materialist that includes the brain, but you also have this thing riding on top. But instead of saying it rides on top in a way where it's disconnected and can't really affect anything, a qualiaist might be, I kind of made up that term a little bit, qualia-ist, but this camp of people who care about qualia, they're sort of saying what the epiphenomenalists are saying, which is that there's this magical seeming, beautiful, musical quality to being, but it's also a thing that affects things. It's not that it's just accidentally there. It's that you are pursuing things because of the pleasure of those things. And those things are affecting your historical will and the nations and what they're doing. And it's very much a part of the real world, and it has real world consequences, and it's affecting other parts of being because it's affecting your consciousness, and your consciousness is in your brain, and all of that can affect the body. And so they're kind of trying to maybe weasel their way out of the dualistic interaction problem by saying, well, let's add qualia to the things that matter can do, or nature. Again, well, let's not be materialist about it. Let's say it's nature. Nature is more magical than the materialists want to say it is. But I'm not saying there's two different substances, and I'm not saying there's the supernatural in the material. I'm saying the natural itself has this quality. We have evidence of it. Everybody sees it all the time. It's what it's like to be. It's everybody's constant experiments are testing and confirming it's true, at least for each individual. And so, what's so irrational about saying that that's a part of being? And it's not really reducible to something materialistic, but it's very much in the play. It's a part of what's making things happen, and things that happen affect it. And it's a part of the ingredients and the formula and what you have to take into account. So holy mackerel, we have really looked at a lot of things. Now we can say, well, they didn't really talk about this in Edwards and Papp, but we mentioned them earlier. There's other monists who are idealists. Everything is the mind rather than everything is the body. The body is nothing but a conception of the mind, just like the monistic materialists say the mind is nothing but something the body does. The notions of body and the impressions that body seems to make are something that the mind is doing, according to the idealist monist. And of course, they wouldn't have a problem with the interactionist problem, but they might have other problems. And the materialist monists have other problems. Like, all of these camps have such philosophical problems that no matter which camp seems most appealing to you, the reason why there's so many camps still alive is that nobody can win this battle, right? Unlike the last one where he sort of had two camps and a group of people trying to make peace, what we have in this one is like 25 camps that are all subdividable, and nobody is taking the field, really. Maybe the majority of people right now are dualistic interactionists of one type or another, but there's so many different types. There might be a dualistic interactionist type for every single dualistic interactionist. I mean, we're going to see how crazy this gets, but these are a lot of camps. And then the last group that they do talk about are agnostic interactionists. These guys are interesting. Here's what they say. They say, clearly there's a body. Clearly there's a mind. Clearly these are two different things. Obviously, they interact in two different directions. The mind affects the body, and the body affects the mind. You want to know my answer to how they interact? Who the hell knows, right? They just say, look, that's a real problem. Everybody who thinks they've solved it hasn't. I've looked at their answers. Those are not answers. The problem persists. It really exists. But that doesn't mean that I can't notice that there is a mind, there is a body, they are interacting in both directions. I just have no gosh darn clue how that's possible. And hopefully we'll figure it out one day, or maybe we'll never be able to figure it out. And some of them might have arguments for why you'll never be able to figure it out. They're agnostics, after all. So that's an interesting group. We're going to be looking at each of these guys. And then there are the pseudo-problemists. And some of the parallelists we've looked at, or the different groups, might fall into a pseudo-problemist perspective. But a pseudo-problemist is saying, look, this entire problem does not really exist for one of a few different reasons. And one of the reasons that we'll be looking at in this chapter is the idea that it says, look, you're right. You can't explain how a mind over here or a body over here could really affect each other. They're just so different. They're so separate. They're so distanced from each other. The problem is, what would an answer to that question look like? Well, if you want me to explain how the mind affects the body, what I'm going to have to do is come up with a series of intermediary steps, because that's what an explanation is, one of them might say. So let me say that the first thing the mind does is it does something that's sort of 90% mind-ish, but 10% body-ish. And then that bumps into the next domino that does something a little 20% body-ish and a little 80% mind-ish. And then that goes on until you get 90% body-ish and only 10% mind-ish. And then the final step is that you've done something to the body, and the body continues the dominoes with body things. And that's not such a problem unless you're Mellenbrunch. You think, Stephen, that's insane to think is possible. Okay, that type of explanation is the only type that could satisfy you, say the pseudo-problemists. But that type of answer is either ridiculous or completely unnecessary when you realize that the last entity of body is where body stops, and the first part of mind is where mind begins, or vice versa. So therefore, there is no gap between them. There's nothing to explain because you're just immediately connected to each other. And so why would I cover a gap that doesn't exist? All that's left after body is mind. All that's left after mind is body. And I'll add you back in here. All that's left after mind is body. All that's left after body is mind. And so there is no gap to cover. I don't have to cover the gap. The two are touching each other. And an explanation for something really just means give me the intermediary steps. There are no intermediary steps. So therefore, you're all confused in thinking that there's a problem here when there's not. There are other ways of being pseudo-problemists about this specific problem, but that's the one Edwards and Papp talk about in the introduction. So it's at least an illustration of a way where someone is going to try to argue that we're confused in thinking that there's a problem. So, hey, I solved it in the sense of saying there was never a problem there to begin with, kind of thing. Okay, I think that's our last slide. Yeah. So, wow. First thing is you guys are super into AI from our personal conversations. So this is the basic foundational groundwork for a lot of AI philosophy stuff. So let's pay careful attention to this section. It's going to be awesome. And it's going to lay the groundwork for some really great things in the future. The second thing is, holy cow. All right. We went from two different camps and a let's make peace to everybody's trying to solve this in many different ways. And nobody is in a camp where the other groups can't say there's a problem with that idea. There's a problem with that idea. And so we're going to look at the problems with all of these explanations and all of these ideas. And we're going to look at the arguments for them from people who are championing them. And if you have the philosophical instinct to like questions more than answers, now's the time to have some fun, right? We're going to have nothing but questions, and these are the foundation for even bigger and wilder other questions. And this one isn't going away anytime soon. If you want consensus anyway, it's certainly not. So I usually go to have discussions with you in the after show, and then I always wish that they were recorded. So why don't we just keep recording? I have a question for each of you. I'm sure you have some things to say, and so we'll get to those things. But before we get to them, I just want to ask one question. Of all these ideas we just covered, and you may have heard of all of them, or you may have been introduced to a couple new ones, or maybe most of them sound new to you, or even the problem itself is not really a problem most people are aware of the way they are of the determinism free will problem, which is, of course, connected. But of all of these positions, I would like to know, do you think there's one that you most fit into right now? Which one do you like the most, or which one seems to be a reflection of what you think about mind and body the most? It doesn't matter in the sense that your views will probably evolve over the course, but where are you now, Twilight?
I've always been favorable to panpsychism. Then again, I don't know a ton about it. I guess it's kind of just my intuition. I'm definitely drawn to idealism. Like, even though it seems far-fetched to me, it has a lot of appeal, and I almost want to make it work. Like, try to find a way that it can make sense.
Okay.
I think what it sounds like is the consensus, but is least interesting to me is just the dualism. The general dualism just seems kind of lame, and like it sounds like something that is status quo and could be true, but I just think that whatever is the reality of the universe, it's very profound, and it's not something lame like that.
Okay. Well, first of all, it's not a consensus, but probably most people seek refuge in that camp. So it might be the majority of philosophers fit in there. I like your instinct to say, well, that's lame already. I want to go in another direction. I think that's actually a very good instinct. The other thing that you need to remind yourself of is this. The reason that dualistic interactionists are in there is that they feel they have to explain themselves. In other words, there's not just one camp of dualistic interactionists. There's a whole bunch of people thinking they can be dualistic interactionists and trying to argue that it works in one way or another. And the reason why there's so many different camps of them within that camp is that none of them have been able to succeed. So when we look at the dualistic interactionists, we won't be reading people who say, oh, it's very simple. This happens and this happens. This is how it interacts. It's all very mechanical. I've just explained it. Instead, you're going to have people saying, oh my God, here's a real problem. Let me try to figure it out. I think I've got a solution. And then the next dualistic interactionist says, that doesn't work. Here's a better way that it works. And so it's not boring in the sense that they're wrestling with a real problem and trying to solve it. But maybe the reason why most people are dualistic interactionists is because there's a lot of different ways of being a dualistic interactionist. And so really, it's like saying there's 100 different camps that make up the largest camp. Scott Adams today talked about a poll that was really funny. Did you guys hear about that? It's almost an illustration of what I'm talking about here. The poll that says, what's your biggest concern with President Biden? And they asked Democrat supporters. And the first one was his competence. And the second one was his mental ability. And the third one was his propensity to say silly things or to misspeak. And the fourth one was his age. And the fifth one was, all right, there were like 5, 6, 7 answers that all meant the same thing. So they could say, well, only 7% of people are concerned about Biden's age. Only 12% of people are really concerned with his competency. Only 6% of people think that he's a guy that really doesn't know how to speak confidently or coherently at any time. Well, add them all together, it's like 98% of Democrats are highly worried about Biden's ability to sound like a human being and stay alive for the next hour, right? Like, so it was a way of making it seem like nobody's concerned by cutting it into a bunch of different categories. So maybe it seems like everybody's in this category of dualistic interactionists, but really we haven't even heard any of them try to explain how this is possible. And when they do, we might find a lot of different camps inside that are not even compatible with each other at all. By the way, I just want to underline, I really like your instinct to say go another way. I also want to say that panpsychism is an interesting idea. It's definitely a really interesting idea, and so is a very similar thing of the qualia-ist perspective. I find ideas that nature is more super than you think it is, and so they get rid of reductive materialism, but they don't necessarily have to affirm something supernatural to do it. As a very, I would say it's a very small camp that's growing, and what you want to look at is where the trends are moving rather than what the trend is at the time maybe. And in any case, even if nobody was in it, it's an interesting set of ideas. Savad or Path, who would like to go next? In the meantime, we can say that your other idea that you were interested in was this idealism idea. And the idealism idea, it could be that you say, well, there's nothing but my mind, and my mind is dreaming, and I'm dreaming everything, a very anti-realist kind of perspective, or like the only thing that's real is my dreaming mind or whatever. But another way of thinking about it is everything is real. What could be more real than the things that are in the dreams of the mind of God? And so God is creating in his mind all of this, and we're nothing but the characters in his dream. But boy, it feels real to me. I mean, what could be more real than that kind of a thing? And there's a question about whether or not that's really real or not. The panpsychists have the ability to bring in a fundamental consciousness element to being without saying it's all just a dream a little bit more easily, which is the other view that you think you're maybe more in line with, where the panpsychists are saying, oh, mind isn't floating above everything else. It's fundamental to being, even the being of a rock. But that doesn't mean a rock is thinking conscious thoughts. Heck, a dog isn't probably thinking propositional conscious thoughts. But that doesn't matter. There's still that consciousness element is fundamental to being, and it goes all the way down. It's a part of everything that is. And that has less of a problem with well, it has its own problems, but it avoids some of the problems of anti-realism, which are really lurking around and actually a part of, like an embraced part of certain types of idealism. Path, you unmuted.
Yeah, I did. I'm gonna blame the pain pills, but I tried to screenshots. So all these terms are coming at me pretty fast. So yeah, if you back up a few slides, the only thing I could say, if you're asking me who I would think I identify most with, there was one slide where the body, well, the mind was contained within the body, and no, the brain was contained within the body, and then the mind was just separate. I think that, it's a big square for the two. Yeah, it was right around here, but I'm not sure which. I forget the name of it, but that one I was kind of drawn to. But I'm having a hard time with the focus, so I'm a little loopy today.
Oh, you can't see the picture too well?
Well, thought I took a screenshot of it, but I'm going through the gallery here on my phone and I can't find it. So
Well,
I'm
it's
not doing
open.
too well today, boss.
I moved the slide to what I think you're talking about. So if you go back to
No,
the
there's
video,
one where there was a square that had, if I
I
recall
see.
correctly, the body. And you made a comment about, oh, this one's better too. So it was very early, very early. And that one seemed kind of like at least a diagram. But a lot of this is coming at me pretty fast, these terms. So I'm not sure who
That's
I would
okay.
identify with because I have no prior knowledge.
Are
Yeah.
you talking about this one here, where there's this
No,
body?
it was very early. And you had, if I recall correctly, I think it was the third slide. Okay. The next one. The next one after this in sequence. Yeah. So this one.
Okay.
The dualistic. I don't know if I identify with these people or not, but I liked it when this diagram came up, and there's a lot of things that somewhat sounded good, but I can't really remember which ones to attribute them to be honest.
Okay. No, that's fine. This is a real tsunami of a whole bunch of different camps and a whole bunch of different ideas, all surrounding a question that isn't really the kind of question that most people are even conscious of before they get into it in philosophy. Like the determinism free will one, we've heard and talked about that a lot, and there's other questions that we'll be more familiar with. So this is a tsunami of a whole bunch of it's like we said we're going to survey the battlefield of these different fields in philosophy, and now we just parachuted ourselves into the middle of a raging battle with like 18 different camps of people with artillery firing at each other. And so it's a lot. So when we go through the chapter and we read excerpts from each of these people, we'll get more and more familiar with these different camps. The point of this slide that you're interested in is that this picture here is really the same as the picture to the left. I just sort of drew the brain out so that we could see all of the ways that things are interacting. But that is really supposed to be this one that you liked here, where it's body and brain, but then mind is something completely different. And the mind is affecting the physical, and the physical is affecting the mental. And that would be the dualistic interactionists. They say there's two things, body and mind. You're both. And they're interacting. And then everybody says, how the hell can they interact? And then the dualistic interactionists respond in some way and say, well, here's how they could interact. And they try to come up with answers. So we'll be looking at different dualistic interactions.
And the reason why, if I may, I this one, for some reason, dropped my attention, or the way I'm come to this is, so we're not doing the mind. So obviously the third thing would be the soul or spirit. We're doing mind and body only. And so this is a way, what I think, this is what I think, I don't know, but this is a way to kind of, I mean, for me, there's a lot of people that would attribute the third thing, but here we are with the two things, and I think it's correct for terminology's sake, I'd say. The brain is a physical organ contained within the body, right? But the mind, it's like putting the extra emphasis on the mind, kind of creating not a soul out of the thoughts, but the thoughts and the rationality and the logic are a separate thing from the physicality. And so it's a very so that's why I really don't know who I identify with, but I identify with the diagram. It seems more accurate, or there's something there, I guess, is what I'm trying to say. I really don't know.
Once again, Path, you bring up a really, really important point, and I should have talked about this before. So there are philosophers who recognize a third thing, a spiritual thing, as distinct from the mind and distinct from the body. Most philosophers, when you say soul, they think, oh yes, soul, mind, same thing, right? So often, I keep putting mind in here as the other thing, but many of the people writing in these different essays will say soul, or many of the ones maybe that we're not looking at in these essays who are dealing with this question will talk about mind as soul, right? Brain is physical, but there's a soul element. And so soul, mind, consciousness, different philosophers will use these different words to try to talk about the same thing sometimes, right? So I'm not saying each philosopher uses all three interchangeably. I'm saying when one philosopher is talking about X and the other philosopher is talking about X, one will say soul while another says mind. Now, I said most philosophers don't talk about a third thing, but what would be an accurate way of saying this? When we get to the third year course, we'll find out that all of the best philosophers do. And when I say best, I don't mean I like them best because they do. I mean the ones whose names you've heard, right? The ones who everybody has heard their names, you know, the ones that had the biggest impact on philosophy do. Often they use spirit and soul interchangeably, the way the most of the rest of philosophers use soul and mind interchangeably. But the spirit is really, it's mostly recognized by all philosophers, including those few that I was talking about who are sort of at the top of the mountain in a lot of different ways in philosophy, that, at least from the perspective that we'll be looking at. Like, we can't explain everything from 2 and 3rd year stuff right now, but most philosophers, including those, they think it's proper for philosophers to have propositional, rational, argumentative discussions about everything that is. And so they have a philosophy of the spirit, and they have a philosophy of religion, and they have a philosophy of the divine, and they talk about these things. But they also recognize that theology is a different discipline that maybe can come to the same conclusions in different ways, and maybe has access to more knowledge or different knowledge about those things than philosophers can have access to. Many of the philosophers will say that, which is interesting, because you would think that anybody playing any game would say this is the game, that's everything you need. And certainly philosophers tend to think that they at least have a right to talk about anything. If you think it's real, let's talk about it. And they certainly do. And that's why, you know, philosophers are not biologists, but there's a philosophy of biology. Likewise, philosophers are not theologians, although some of them have a foot in both worlds, and some of them synthesize prophetic speaking outright. That's not even just being a theologist, but being like a mythopoetic religious figure, as well as being a philosopher. There are certain philosophers that absolutely synthesize those two and know that they're doing it. Very rare, but it's there, and we'll look at that. We'll look at that a lot in the 2nd and 3rd year. Nietzsche is one of those paths who does that consciously and explicitly. And you've been talking about asking questions about Nietzsche, so the reason why we dedicate our entire 3rd year mostly to wrestling with Nietzsche is because he's one of those 1 in 10 billion thinkers. And we look at a few others in the 3rd year too that are on that level. So I'm thinking about them right now while I'm trying to describe that. So let's say this. Let's say with all of that exists and it's completely legitimate, and we're going to spend a lot of time looking at it. It's powerful stuff. In most of philosophy, let's say the lesser philosophers who are still way above my head and way above everybody else here, and we wrestle with them for good reason. We learn a lot by studying them. Most of them say, look, when you say soul, you mean mind. And when I say mind, I mean soul. And we're both talking about the same thing there. And so that's part of answering this question of how come they're not bringing in the soul. Many of the people who write about mind are thinking soul, or they'll say soul, but they're talking about the exact same thing that other philosophers in the same discussion are using the word mind to discuss. So there's a bit of overlap there. And like I said, when we get to some wild stuff, there's a bit of overlap between soul and spirit, and the triunity of humanity and of all nature is something that some philosophers really talk about, some of the big ones that we'll talk about a long distance in the future. But you're absolutely right to recognize that there are spiritual traditions, there are theological traditions, and there are philosophical, like philosophy of religion traditions, and just philosophical traditions on this topic that recognize a trinity at the base of humanity, like a triunity of being itself. And even if they don't recognize that, they think of humanity, it's not as made up of 2 things, but as made up of 3 things. I would say most likely everybody we're going to read discussing this topic, so not in all their writings, but just discussing this topic in this chapter, are most likely going to have a perspective where if you're concerned with soul, I mentioned that when I said mind. That's what I'm talking about. I'm talking about that thing that feels and exists. Now, again, you might say blasphemy, or you might even just say logical absurdity. There's clearly a distinction, and I know that there's a difference there, and that's all well and good, and you're probably right. We're just going to have to say, let's put that question aside, or let's keep it in our minds. If you really think it's extremely important to why these people are having problems, keep it in your mind all the time and try to challenge your idea by their ideas. And also, if you find their ideas failing, you might find the source of why they're failing in this idea of yours of the Trinity nature of being a person. So feel free to think about it all you want. We're just going to have to accept that in this course, we're mostly going to be looking at people who say, of course, a soul, or of course, not a soul. But both of them are saying the same thing when they say a soul, it means mind. And the other ones say, mind isn't brain, that's soul. That's something outside the material. It's different. I'm talking about a soul when I talk about mind. And then the others who say, not a soul, just a mind, they still mean something different from the body. And so it'll get a little bit, we'll focus on it as much as you want to. I probably wouldn't focus on it unless you wanted to, but we will focus on it as much as you want to, because it's probably really important. And it might even be the source of you standing in a position where you can see clearly why a certain argument is wrong or what's missing in the explanations or something. So that's fine. We'll talk about it as much as you like. But for getting through these essays, we're probably just going to have to swallow the pill, accept the fact that these guys, they mean soul/mind. And they're talking about two things. It's really just material and everything that's not material about being a person, something like that. It's very, very simplified. And you shouldn't think that that means that all philosophers think that way. They certainly don't. Many of the philosophers we're reading will talk about other things in other contexts. And the greatest philosophers do talk about, it's not like philosophers say, well, spirit talk, what are you talking about? Like that's not, it's not like that's not appropriate to talk about in philosophy. It's just probably not going to come up much in this section. I think I did a fair job of not misspeaking when I tried to answer that question. Did that answer the question?
Yeah, it was great. Thank you. Yeah, it's a little clarification was great. And I wasn't trying to.
It's a good thing you brought up. It's a good thing you brought up.
I really don't know. To answer your question better, I don't know who I identify with yet. But
right. That's a great place to start. That's a great answer. You're not supposed to, that's as good an answer. That's very much top of the answers. That's a great answer. I'm only asking just so that we can keep track in our own minds, like we're keeping a diary of how our ideas evolve as we get exposed to new arguments and new perspectives. So that's the only reason I'm really asking, is for you to think about it so that you can see your own mind and how it's changing. And maybe you're going to find really good reasons to be in exactly the place you're in, or maybe you're going to sophisticate the place you're in, or maybe it's even going to alter and become radically different. And so we'd have to know where you start out and think about it ourselves and reflect ourselves to think about it in order to appreciate that process. Savad, do you have something you can add here?
Yeah, could you go through the slides?
Yep. I'll just start at the beginning. You tell me when to hit stop.
Okay, thank you.
Let me go back. Let's see.
Yeah, keep going.
That was the end. That was the end. Let's go back to these diagrams, right?
Yeah.
Okay. All is one. Its body. Mind and body are different. They interact. Mind, consciousness, mind stuff just floats on top, but doesn't affect anything.
Oh, is that okay? It doesn't affect anything.
Yeah. So the arrow isn't pointing down from mind. The
Right.
brain is pointing to body. The body is pointing to brain, but the The body brain thing is allowing this mind thing to ride on top. It's just sort of the quality of the experience, but it has no consequence to affect anything.
So it isn't like the mind is accessed through outside of the body, right? You have like it's in a cloud, so like the consciousness of that mind isn't inside the brain. The brain, let's say, is a receiver that is able to channel the mind.
No, that is a perspective. That is absolutely a perspective in this field, but that's not the perspective of the epiphenomenalist. Here's the perspective of the epiphenomenalist. I'll describe it better right now. If you look at a river, you'll see a whirlpool in the river, and the whirlpool will move around the river and it will flow down the river with the river that's flowing. You will also see bubbles in the river. You will also hear sounds as the river is flowing. All of that superfluous stuff that the river does, the body is doing the mind, but the mind is not consequential. It's not reversing back to affect things and change the course of the river. It's just a nice little feature that rides on top of experience and existence. But it's all really body at the bottom of it all, something like that. That's the epiphenomenalist.
Okay.
attitude.
So, no, I would not.
Yeah, that's not you. All right. Let's go here. I think what you're thinking about is this one. This qualia is riding on top of the brain, but it's a part of affecting things.
Yeah, I'm thinking about it. It's like somebody could be, right, has a body, has a brain, but they're not, let's say, sound of mind. So I look at it as something that is separate.
Oh, wait. You're going to love this term. We're getting into mind and body and as a field, and you're really interested in AI. Here's the term philosophers use for that. Zombie. They talk about zombies. It's like they're going through the motions, but they don't really have a conscious life. Is that what you're talking about?
No, it's well, I guess yes. So somebody, like say somebody isn't sound of mind. They have a brain, they have a body. Then it necessarily doesn't mean that they're sound of mind. But I think it's separate. So I look at it as like the only certain thing I know is that I exist.
Okay.
Let's say for 100% certainty. And I'm able to do that because of my mind, which I think is it's a part of it's connected to my body, but I certainly think it's separate. Like I think it's possible to
Maybe we should add a slide for what you're talking about, because I just noticed it's not really in here, but it is a perspective.
You're not like more than, say, the body. Like I've had, whether you had lucid dreaming or you've had other experiences of just the realization that it's like you are who you are even outside of your body, and you still have this identity. You still have this, how do I put it, right? It's like the body doesn't contain the mind, because you can have a state of mind outside of the body. So therefore, it would seem to me that there's some separation there. You think about there's meditation. and they said lucid dreaming, there's these experiences that people have of leaving their body and going and experiencing things right outside their body, like they're leaving their body. And I've also had some of those experiences. So that would, and I guess the feedback I get from that is while my mind can connect to my body, it's separate. So I'm not sure where that, let's say where that aligns, or where that falls into. So I don't know if it's something that like you channel, right? If you're able to save a frequency that the consciousness is something you're able to channel.
So what I'm going to do is I'm going to add a slide in real time to what I think you're talking about. And it's funny that you just said channel, because I just finished the slide. So I'm going to add it here, and let's see if this works. Does this paint a picture of what you're talking about? It should have been included because it's another view that exists that I failed to remember that they weren't covering. So it's processing and trying to add right now. I don't know why it's taking so long. Let's see if, come on, there we go. Add to stage. All right, let's say, does this match what you're talking about? The mind is there primarily, and the body can act like a radio antenna to channel it. That the body is sort of like a radio, a physical thing that can channel mental, conscious, universal conscious signals, or the consciousness from individuals can be channeled into the individual body or something like that.
Yeah, let's go with that, right? The brain, because it's...
I called it Savadian channeling, by the way. I think I'm getting at what you're talking about. So all right, keep talking about it, because this is an interesting idea. And it's almost the mirror image of that epiphenomenalist view. It's almost like the photographic negative, where they say, well, basically it's material, but there's this little mind thing. And this one's saying, well, basically it's consciousness, divine consciousness, individual soul consciousness, and the body is just a thing that can channel that. It's real, but it's sort of incidental to the mental. It's almost like a photographic negative of that first one we were looking at.
Right. So I'm thinking when we're talking about mind, and there are some cultures and there are some religions that I believe will talk, when you're talking about mind, not necessarily consciousness, I guess spirit, that it would include animals, but I'm not sure. So thinking about that, it's like maybe the mind, right?
It could have
it could be, the mind isn't necessarily the spirit. It could be separate. But what I'm getting to is we don't talk about, right, these animals or other species having the mind as we do with
well, maybe
human beings, right? So while each of us have a body, a different body, each of us has a brain as a species, there's something that certainly sets us apart, which is unknown, and we're obviously trying to uncover and discover what that is. So it leads me to believe, at least at this time, that maybe it's something that is just, it's outside of us, but we have the tools to be able to have access to the mind, let's say. I don't know. Okay,
so I'm going to say body 1, and I'm going to add this in here. So let's draw arrow from here to here. And let's see if this is describing what you're talking about. So there's many different ways that you could have this sort of bodies channeling consciousness idea. And the one that I think you're talking about would look something a bit like this. Let's see if we flesh out this picture just a little bit more fully. And see how that works. Oh, it's a bit small. Let's make it a little bigger. There we go. Okay, and then we'll grab all of this and say boom, boom, something like that. And then we'll just drag that up like that. Okay, this is kind of cool. I think I hear what you're saying, and I think it looks something like this. Let's say remove from studio. This is quite an interesting idea. So that's cool. I asked, where does everybody fall? And some people say, I'm kind of near here, but it's a little bit, and I have no idea where I fall. I can't wait to learn more about it. Your idea is, I've got some well thought out notions. I'm not sure how well they'll stand up against the philosophical arguments, but at least I'm coming to the battlefield with a set of theories and hypotheses, which are kind of interesting. And by the way, some very, very, very bright people alive today are arguing something very similar to what you're talking about. So let's see if this new picture I just threw together matches what you're saying. Let's go. Come on, just skip down. All right, we have to go through it one at a time. All right. No, we don't. Let's skip like this. That'll work. Okay, so we're going to look at this. So the first one I said was this. What if the universal consciousness, or the big consciousness with a big C, includes a lot of things? Maybe it includes, because there's an element of what you're saying where it's this Savadian channeling that's almost a subcategory or has a dimension of panpsychism in it, which is, potentially the case that maybe little bits of rock mentality exist. They're not consciousness like we are. Little bits of dog subjective experience consciousness exist. It's not the same thing as the consciousness we have. But then what if what makes up this cloud of consciousness includes mind 1, mind 2, and mind 3, and body 1 has the ability to channel mind 1, and it channels it through the brain immediately, which then affects the body. Is that mostly sort of a picture of what you're trying to?
Yeah, it does. So for example, I've thought about it. It's like there's all of this dark matter in the universe, and right, we don't know what it is necessarily, how to explain it. I go, what if it's like collective consciousness, or if it's consciousness? I like how that looks, because I think we've all had a moment. You've been with somebody, and you're on the same wavelength. You know what each other is thinking. You are of the same mind without, let's say, not necessarily having to express it through language.
Yeah,
and I think
what you're saying, yeah.
there's something. I think that's something pretty significant. I think, that leads me to believe that there's something more than just this consciousness within each of us that we each have and right experience. There's certainly some level of this cohesive, I want to say hive mind, but there's something that,
like a mental dimension.
Yeah, it would certainly seem more than, okay, yes, we have our brains, yes, we have this consciousness, yes, we have this ability to be able to explain and discover and research. Right, there's something, I think, that it symbolizes just having those moments, or that experience. I think that says there's just something else that, you said, there's some people who, right, have this thought. I think would lead to, look, this is something more than just individual, right? This is something that's universal. somehow. So I do
look,
like how that looks.
everything you're saying, nothing you're saying is laughable. I know we have this impression that, oh, there's a bunch of materialists in philosophy. God dang, no, there's not. The people who think most seriously about these things, only a very slim minority of them are materialists. Also, what's interesting about your train of thought is you're saying, look, if we're trying to solve this problem, why are we looking at bodies so much? Why don't we look at the soulic entanglement that seems to happen between souls? Why don't we look at, okay, here's something that I used to roll my eyes at every time anybody mentioned it. And I just read a scientific essay the other day, which was talking about near-death experience. And when I hear about near-death experience, I have a materialist, reductionist eye roll response. I say, well, you were going out and into consciousness. Who knows what little bits of things you heard or saw it, and you created a picture in your mind, and that's all there is to it. But the scientist said that doesn't really work to explain NDEs, and here's why. We put people into anesthesia all the time who have cardiac problems. None of them have accurate descriptions of what was happening in the room. Sometimes we take their eyes closed. None of the people who go out of consciousness even sound coherent, like they're able to see or hear anything coherently in the world around them before they've even gone unconscious and as they're coming back into consciousness. So none of those people ever report accurately describing what was going on in the operating room. Only the people who nearly die and claim to have had a near-death experience are able to accurately describe what's actually happening. They say things like, I saw the surgeon flapping his arms. And people say, well, that's ridiculous. And the surgeon says, well, I want to keep my hands sterile, so I point at things with my elbows getting ready for prep, and I do it just like this. And another guy was in a comatose state when he was brought to the hospital, and he was in a comatose state for a week. And when he came to, he recognized the nurse, and he said, oh my gosh, I recognize you. You're the nurse that took the dentures out of my mouth and you put them in that cabinet over there when I was first wheeled in here. I saw all of that. And all of it was corroborated by third-party evidence. He says, none of this makes sense when you realize that nobody who goes into anesthesia or goes unconscious in any other situation where they're not having a near-death experience can do anything like that. So that's not conclusive. It was just one study that looked at a couple of cases. Obviously, there's a lot that has to be said on both sides or all sides of that debate still. But the point is that there's approaches to consciousness that say, why don't we try to understand what the mind is actually capable of doing? What about the mystical experience where one mind feels like it's become one with a universal thing and one with everything? It's like, well, this picture of yours certainly seems to make more sense of a lot of that stuff than does maybe any of the other pictures. And there's definitely, absolutely a lot of people who are looking at consciousness in that way, including Jordan Peterson, who doesn't really want to talk about it too much, it seems, but he's very tempted to mention in passing that he thinks that perhaps the body is like a radio that's channeling the mind or something like that. So yeah, there's a lot of people who are talking that way, and that's in no way an unsophisticated thought. It's absolutely on the battlefield as a way of trying to, and it has a very unique approach, which is saying, let's start with thinking about what the mind can do, and then we'll reverse engineer into saying, well, okay, how's it interacting with the body, or how's the body able to channel or get messages from that or have impressions from it or something like that. So yeah, that should have been included. I'm glad you brought that up. That's absolute. Well, let's call it Savadian channeling for now, since nobody else brought it up, and I don't really have a better title for it from the literature. And that's a great perspective. So basically your answer was none of these people have it right. I think it's more like this. And you happen to mention something that Edwards and Pap just didn't bring up and that I forgot to include. So that's fantastic. If we thought the battlefield was crowded a moment ago, there's another giant that just entered into it. So that's good.
I stepped out of the room for just a second. I came back and we were on my favorite topic of near-death experiences. So I was like, I this question has been on my mind as part of why, well, it's not just why, but it's one of the reasons why I'm interested in idealism, because I mean, it's possible that maybe not so much that our material world is not real, but that it's less real, because that actually corresponds with near-death reports. And what's interesting is I never knew that near-death experiences, at least in the West, date all the way back to Plato's Republic. That kind of blew my mind when I read that. But
There's reincarnation too.
yeah.
There's some wild stories about a philosopher who remembers being somebody else in a previous life. And then he said, by the way, when I was that person, I inscribed a message in my shield that you guys put at the top of that temple or whatever. And he told them what it said. And then they took it down and read it. And they were like, oh my gosh, there seemed to be some confirmation. I mean, it's basic version of the story. I don't remember all the details, but it's essentially like that. So anyway, go ahead.
Yeah. So, shit. Sorry, my cat ran out of the house.
Well, there's something about the Savadian idea that is a mirror image, or really a photographic negative of that epiphenomenalist thing. It's not saying it's all consciousness necessarily or all brain, but it's saying that the body is almost incidental, or it's a creation of the mind, sort of, or it's a useful thing that interacts with the mind, the mental, but it's mostly the foundational reality is this consciousness, and then the secondary thing is the physical, which is the opposite of that epiphenomenal attitude, which it's basically physical, and this mental thing sort of floats on top.
And would this also be compatible? It could be considered like a type of dualism.
Yeah, so it can be, right? So if you have the view that Savad has, but you take it to the point where you're really saying the only thing that is really is consciousness, and the body is sort of a dream, objects and bodies are dreams of the mind, and they're a thing the mind is creating, then you're really an idealist, right? So you could have this view and be an idealist, and you could be an idealist and therefore an anti-realist, which you don't have to be. The reason why I mention that is that that's not necessarily an anti-realist perspective. You can believe in a real world, but that you can believe that it's fundamentally mental, or you can believe that it's mental and physical, but the mental is primary and the physical is secondary. I'm not going to tell you what I believe, but I'll simply mention that none of these things we've talked about are what I happen to think is the case. But we're getting closer, by the way, so, and these are all very interesting. I just want to underline that I'm talking about them not because I'm endorsing any of these views, but yeah, those are all three things totally thinkable, right? You could say, we could add another arrow here where the body is affecting the soul, and it's, through the actions of the body, the soul is becoming polluted, or it's becoming enlightened or something. And so we really should have another arrow pointing up from the body. Maybe it's able to broadcast back to the mental and really affect that realm as well. And you could almost consider them on equal playing field, right? Where the mind really is different from the body. So it's a dualism of a sort. But you could be a monist as well, right? So it depends on how you want to interpret this picture. You could say body and physical is just as important as mental and spiritual and conscious, but here's sort of how they're interacting. The body is a thing that can channel consciousness. So when your body dies, the consciousness continues, perhaps. By the way, we haven't talked at all about death, but the section we're talking about is body, mind, and death. And many of the essays we're going to be reading are going to be asking the question of immortality and asking the question of, okay, how do the body and mind interact? And what does that mean to the question of, can the mind outlive the body, right? So that's very much something we're going to be talking about, although we haven't really discussed it in this intro very much. In any case, to answer your question, and then I'm going to shut up because I have a feeling you wanted to continue there. But to answer the question, this Savadian channeling model here, It could be interpreted as dualistic, where both are significant and they're communicating to each other in this sort of way. It could be interpreted as primarily it's consciousness, but there is this other thing, sort of the photographic negative of the epiphenomenalism. It could be interpreted in an idealistic way, which is basically there really isn't body. Body is one of the qualities of a sub-dream. Like you can dream in ideas, you can dream personalities, the consciousnesses can interact with each other in this dream. It's more than one mind dreaming, perhaps. But one of the things that minds can dream is a physical world. And then that physical world follows rules that those minds interact with. And so the physical is the creation of the mental. And then you can go even further and say, no, it's really a dream. It's just a mind dreaming, and that mind is not physical, and there is nothing physical. And so the answer is Savadian channeling that he's been talking about here does not put you in any one of those categories. You could sort of use this picture so far and find your way into any of those camps, I think.
Yeah, I have a lot of thoughts that basically stem from this topic. So I guess I don't want to get too off topic with it, but one of the appeals of idealism to me is the question of suffering. You know, like which always comes up in any kind of, I don't know, philosophical inquiry or whatever. And in my opinion, just like where I'm at right now, I think of what are different ways that can justify suffering and the universe still be like fundamentally good. And there's another way I can't think at the top of my mind, but the one way right now, okay, I can think now, but idealism is one way of explaining, like one way is a way of justifying it, in that if nothing's really real, how much are we really suffering? So like, for instance, you use your example of going under anesthesia, and if I'm correct, because I don't know the science of it, but I feel that I've read that they don't even know like what our consciousness is like when we're under it. It's possible that we are actually aware, but we just don't have any memory. And so it's like, what would we be, for instance, would we be suffering if we had no memory of it? Like if there was no memory and we were just suffering in the moment? I don't know. So there's different ways I think of the question of like suffering and how it could be justified. And this is one way in which basically, for instance, if you have a nightmare, like just think of like the scariest moments people have been in their life. I mean, arguably could be their worst nightmares, you know? I mean, we even have a term for it, you know, it's your worst nightmare. So it's like we're super scared. So we're in this state of terror or whatever, but nothing's actually happening. We wake up and we're like, oh, it's no big deal. You know, it's not a big deal. It was just a nightmare. Like, what if we wake up from the horrors of everyday, like for people who are actually, you know, say they're being mutilated, you know, say, I like to think of worst case scenarios. So, say somebody's being tortured and to die and wake up and find, oh, this was like actually not just like how we'd wake up from a nightmare. And it's like, and that's sort of goes into the appeal of different like Eastern or Buddhist concepts for me, which is like, somebody said, I got it wrong before, but I think that it's detachment from like the temporal experience. And so it's like, that's a way of, I don't know, sort of like, I don't know, but basically that's a whole different thing. But for me, what appeals to me of idealism is that it can can account for this question of, can the universe be like, I don't know. I don't know what the right word is. I'm just gonna say decent. Can the universe be decent and still accommodate for all of the suffering? I know that goes into another part in which I think that in the West, in the modern age, we don't think about suffering enough because we don't deal with it enough compared to other places and times in history. And I feel that other places and times in history
Well,
had to address this.
So I like your train of thought, and I like what motivates it, and it's very interesting. Couple of questions to consider as you try to build this model, or test it or consider it. The answer to your question, if it's in the context of the model that you're proposing, is you ask the question, well, how much are we really suffering? If it's all just our dream, or it's all just God's dream, or it's a dream that can be woken up from, that type of thing. And the answer to that question might be our capacity for suffering is as infinite as the hell as our consciousness is aimed at wanting to get to. Right? So it might be more suffering than you think, even with this solution, potentially, if the mind that's dreaming wants, Jung had this idea that the tendrils of the human psyche descend all the way into hell, all the way down into hell. And so the first thing we know is that everything that people have experienced, if your model is true, is dreamt, which means the dreamer, or the collective dreamers, or the divine dreamer, is just like you said with a nightmare. Like when you dream a nightmare, you're dreaming something horrible, but then you wake up and you go, oh, wow, I learned something, or what a show, right? And it's sort of like, it's not really that serious because you can wake up is the idea. And I get that point. And I'm not trying to knock that point down. That point seems to mean what you want it to mean in this formula for what you're trying to accomplish. So I'm not criticizing it at all. But we have to wonder what these minds are aimed at. And if they're really aimed at hell, that dream could get pretty bad. And I don't know. So I think the answer is we're going to suffer as much as the perversion of the mind that's doing the dreaming wants suffering.
Yeah, no, go ahead.
If that model of yours is correct, that's all I'm saying. Go ahead.
It's really interesting to think about because, well, one way of thinking about it is I had a history of sort of like,
Hey, you want to hear something fucking insane? It's a small thing.
Yeah, go ahead.
Small. Oh. Sorry, I was talking to somebody else.
Okay, yeah, hit mute. That's okay. Go ahead, Twilight.
Hopefully this will be as insane. But so I used to, and I still to some degree have I don't know, psychosomatic syndromes aren't a good description of it because when I compare it to other people's, it's just not the same. Like my mind can create unbelievable like symptoms that like just blow my mind at how they can be real and be really originate in my mind, and once I figure it out usually goes away or it cycles. That's another problem. But what's interesting about it is when I used to have this a lot worse, it would which I actually read William James had similar, I think it was called neurasthenia. It's sort of similar. But what's interesting is once I, start to actually it's before I realize what's going on. I'm like, there's a symptom, it's getting really bad. I'm focusing on it. I'm thinking, catastrophizing all this shit. And then it gets worse and worse and worse. And then at some point, once I realize that I'm feeding into it and it's growing or whatever, it's like once I've reached its worst, then it starts to fade away and go away. But it's just like you're saying about you like.
Well, that's interesting. There's a bottom to it in the sense that, yeah, keep going. That's quite interesting.
Well, yeah, it's just like how you were saying, like the hell is as bad as your consciousness, wants to go to, and that's been my experience. Like it's I can basically imagine, like, I think just the way my mind works is just morbid, and so because I'm sort of like the perfect test subject, I guess, or the perfect host for hellish thoughts, basically. Like I like any category of horror, like I like horror stories, horror movies, all that stuff. I like all that, but so I have a proclivity for that, and I think it just follows that for it to manifest itself like that in ways that are like, I look around, nobody else has these problems. It's like,
well, I don't know that nobody else has those problems. I think those problems are more common than people usually. I would say nobody else is willing to straightforwardly and honestly talk about those problems. But I don't think you're as alone as that would make you seem, since other people just aren't talking about it, perhaps. I mean, I don't know the unique features and quality of exactly what you're describing here, because you're not describing it in that kind of detail. But the general description you're giving is something that I think is more common than people admit.
That's true. Most people, because I know people that do have it, and I tell them about it. And I won't tell them like, oh, this is, but I'll tell them, hey, this happens to me. Maybe it's the case for you, maybe it's not, but it happens to me, so maybe it's for you. And they're very defensive about it. And then as time passes, they eventually they'll kind of like start to like subtly admit that that's what the problem was, but without fully admitting it. It's like, I don't know why people are very defensive about like their mind creating problems, but since it's been my life, like I have a whole lifetime of dealing with this kind of stuff. It does, like, I don't care. It's kind of like the least of my problems.
So here's a couple thoughts, and then you can tell me what you think about them, because they're just things I'm considering while you're talking. I understand what you're saying. Like, I fully comprehend it. And, bravo, doing a good job of giving a pretty accurate and self-aware description of some complicated things that most people aren't aware of, if they're even happening to them. So that's really good. It also, it occurs to me. So the first thing that occurs to me is that when traveling through suburbs of hell, if you're aimed at wanting to stay there, that's probably not a great thing. If you have an instinctive proclivity for thinking the real paradise is on the other side, so I have to get through it, that's a different thing, right? Because that's the case, that you can't really get to something paradisical unless you've gone through hell. I mean, that's at least what the stories say. The third thing that occurs to me when you're talking is that you're describing a relationship with a straightforward honesty that's akin to, or maybe exactly on point with, the only thing that helps anyone navigate hell and navigate out of hell again, which is the truth. And never use it again. It's not a thing that necessarily people get out of. And one of the reasons why they don't get out of it is that they get stuck in this idea of repeating lies over and over and over again. Sometimes the lie is that you can't get out. And in that position, the best thing to say is the truth, which is something like, I don't think I can get out. Hey, that's at least the truth, right? It's like, it would be better not to be here, but I may have messed up too much, or I may just be too fucked from the beginning, or damned by God from the start of all time, or whatever the heck it is. You don't know what the truth is when you're in that dark place, but you can say, I don't know what the truth is, and perhaps things could be better, and perhaps there's a way through to the other side. That's the beginning of the smallest level of saying something true. But the point is that Um, I don't know, Winston Churchill had this idea that he didn't trust anybody who didn't walk with a limp, right? Don't trust a man who doesn't walk with a limp, right? And it's sort of similar to this idea that, people who haven't yet descended into hell, they don't really have heaven, even if they think they do. And God bless them. I hope, hell's not a fun journey, but it's a journey that has to be made by some of us. And there's a reward at the end. There's a value. There's things that can be learned. But it is dangerous. And it is a thing that many people don't ever get out of. And some fall in love with it and try to just make it worse and drag other people into it. And they're full of anxiety and insecurity and terrible behavior, and they're self-damaging. I mean, it's not, we're not talking about it lightly when we talk about it in the way we're talking about it. This is a serious thing, but so I guess my only reflections are, you seem to be pretty straightforward and honest, which is, in my estimation, the only hope anybody has of navigating that type of place. I don't know what that message means. Can you hear me? Savad sent a text message, and I don't know what it means. Maybe you misspelled something.
Oh, I was just, oh yeah, I didn't mean to send it. I was still typing. Yeah, okay. I would say, I mean, you're certainly not alone in that. We tend to have this illusion of what's going to happen, or think about what's going to happen, and it's way worse in our mind than it is in the actual reality of it happens. I'd say a lot of the time, not every time, but a lot of the time it's whatever it is, you're thinking about it, right? The analytical mind can be a real bitch sometimes, and just get inside your own head. And it's right. I mean, what we believe is our reality, right? The perception of how we think of ourselves, of how we are going to handle a situation, how we think we may handle a situation, tends out to be the reality. So I think something that could be helpful is just reminding, and I'll do it for myself, is, look, I can think about 100 different ways this is going to happen, and a lot of the time, whatever it is that happens, it isn't that, or it wasn't as bad, it wasn't as painful, it wasn't, none of the conflict or issues had come up that I had anticipated, that I had worried about, that I had anxiety about, right? So I think and I think a lot of the time, when we're talking about mind, it can be ego, possibly, and our ego can be our enemy at times. So I'd say a helpful way to look at it is being aware of how we perceive not only ourselves as the reality we believe, but how we perceive a situation and handling it. So I think just being aware of that is certainly helpful. But you're not alone by any means for what you experience.
Yeah, amen. Agreed.
Yeah, I think definitely agree with that over time. I think probably people experience it in degrees and volume. I think it does go. It's just interesting how you pointed that out there about like whether you're passing through hell or what. There's something about there's something about me that is like, all right, I do want to pass through it eventually, but it's like I just kind of want to spend time in hell. I don't know why. not spend time in it myself, but it's like there's I don't know what it is, like the morbid fascination. I'd be interested if they in what science is out on that, on what creates that. But I think I've always been this way too. It's like and so it's easy to get drawn towards the morbid, like the worst case.
Thank you, Savad, for what you said. I think it was really on point, and I think I appreciate that. Twilight, I have a couple of reflections on what you just said there. So it occurs to me that the reason why people like horror movies is that they're in a safe environment by choice, willingly, like their consciousness is saying, yes, I want this, confronting themselves with the things that seem most terrifying. And that in doing so, they get this feeling of not just relief, but potentially increased competence to handle the things that seem most terrifying. That maybe there's a subconscious instinct. I'm talking generally, people. I'm not saying specifically in your case. I'm saying in general, the reason why people are generally drawn to those horror movies is that there is a lot of ugly, morbid reality, and not facing it seems like a way stupider solution than facing it, even though facing it is really terrifying to most people. And so many people would choose to stay in a dream or a delusion to not face it. So with that being said, there are two potential things, and I don't know which applies to you. So you just go ahead and respond to this however you like. One instinct could be, I'm drawn to it because I know there's something there that needs to be faced, that needs to be dealt with, that needs to be incorporated, a dragon that needs to be slayed, a demon that needs to be stared in the eyes. I know that my path towards victory of something requires that this be dealt with, and that instinct is not allowing me to stop focusing on it until I deal with it. However, it's also possible to want hell. Not for the sake of... So I guess the question is whether or not there's a vision for things to be better. Are you, in other words, I'm not concerned with whether or not someone is high on top of a mountain or deep in a pit of hell. I'm more concerned with which direction they're aiming. I think that's more important. You can be in a very privileged position that you maybe didn't really do much to earn, and you may be aiming at making things worse in such a great place that you're making them worse doesn't immediately look like a catastrophe for everything. You can be in a pit of hell so deep and you're aiming at making it worse that you're dragging people into it as desperately as you can. And that's a real bad place to be because it's bottomless, because you can always make it worse no matter how bad it is. But then there's people who are aiming up, whether they're in a very great place and they've gone through a lot and they've accomplished a lot, and they're aiming at saying, look, things are great, but they're nothing like the infinitely better that they could be. And so I'm striving and working desperately hard to make them better. And people can be in a very, very, very bad pit that they fell into through mistake or through bitterness or through dishonesty with themselves, or an inability to face things about themselves or things that were done to them. All sorts of different ways that people can get in a very low pit. And what's exciting and encouraging to me is that the choice to decide to aim up in that pit, even if it feels like a bloodying your fingernails and scrambling towards a light, aiming at that light is all that matters. And it's infinitely more powerful. And when we say there's a lot of lies in hell, the one main lie is don't look up. You're here and this is all there is, and you're never getting out of this. That's the lie that has to constantly be repeated, because it is a lie, because it is as easy as deciding, you know what, this sucks and I want something better and I want the world to be better. And if you make that decision, it's an incredibly powerful shift that is way more important than being in a good place. And of course, it leads to being in a better place. but it seems to me like that's a very important shift. And people have the right to decide to aim down if they want to. So I'm not saying that you should aim up, but that would be the question, I think, to ask is, do you want things to be better, or do you want them to always be getting worse? That's a question for you to ask yourself. I mean, you can answer if you want, but I think that's the question that matters.
Yeah, I have the thought of an answer, but I don't want to sidetrack or anything.
I'm done.
So my thinking of it was, I mean, it probably wouldn't be the second one, but I guess you could say it like wanting things to be better, but the thought occurred to me that it's almost like, well, I think as you're explaining that, I think for maybe like for myself and maybe others, I think like experience with the horror or the morbid, it almost like amplifies the good or the normal, maybe. Like I know that I have I don't know, it's almost like you can't have light without the dark kind of thing, where it's like it makes you appreciate the mundane, even, like makes you appreciate just regular life. For me, like if you finish a really good horror movie, you would just appreciate everything. You're like, oh, I'm not getting strangled with my intestines. That's cool. but but other, I don't know, like, so maybe that's my motivation. It's to acquire a zest for life, maybe through seeing the worst of it. I don't know. It's my idea.
I know what you're saying. Look, we're all talking as carefully as we can, because I think every one of us here has personal understanding of navigating suburbs of hell. And it's a serious thing, and it's a dangerous thing. I would probably describe myself as still climbing out. And so I hear what you're saying. And like I said, I don't think you leave hell through the same door you entered. You push through to the other side, right? But I also don't think that you blithely and naively think that it isn't something that could utterly destroy you, because it absolutely is. Or at least maybe it isn't something that can destroy you. It's something that can destroy. So maybe you know yourself, and look, I've got a vision. I know where I'm heading. I've built a relationship with the truth, and that's the thing that's guiding me here, perhaps. But it is real danger. And again, I say this all in the context of having already said the only way to paradise is getting through hell. So I'm not saying it's dangerous and you shouldn't have gone. I'm saying it's dangerous. Just keep that in mind. And keep in mind the truth point, and keep in mind the aiming at things being better point. And I think you're not alone, even in this room, of people who understand that type of journey. I got there through a lot of disappointment and foolish decisions that bitterness is the shorthand word for it. In any case, we've all found hell appealing for one reason or another, but we're rooting for you, and we're on the side of you coming out the other side and being a badass motherfucker who has new powers he never had before because he faced the darkness, that's the hero journey. So we're on the side of you doing that, and none of us are saying, oh, bad on you for getting there. Well, no, you have to get there. Like you've been talking about, the part of the motivation is to say there's something here that needs to be dealt with. And the tall growths have deep roots, right? Like you have to go down to the the bottom if you want something that gets up really high, is sort of the idea. Why don't we end the recording and continue talking about this together? How about that?